Okay, so to kick off this deep dive, I want to start with a number that I just kept, well, I kept circling it in the notes.
Oh, I think I know the one.
Yeah, because it doesn't just represent a statistic, you know? It represents this fundamental breaking point in human history.
Right.
Between 1700 and 1800, the population of Europe didn't just grow, it exploded.
It really did.
We're talking about a jump from roughly 120 million to 190 million people in a single century.
It is a staggering shift.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the graph of human population up to that point, it's this really jagged, slow climb, right?
Yeah, constantly getting knocked back.
Exactly, knocked back by plague and famine. And then suddenly, in the 18th century, the line just goes vertical. It effectively doubles the growth rate in the second half of the century alone.
And naturally, the first assumption, at least the one I made when I first saw the sources, is that this must be a baby boom. Like, I'm picturing these massive 18th century families, people just having kids left and right to fill up the continent. It feels like the only logical way to add 70 million people to the map so fast.
That is the intuitive leap, for sure. But the data tells a completely different and, frankly, a much more interesting story.
Right.
It wasn't a fertility revolution at all. Birth rates didn't rise. In fact, in many parts of Europe, they were stagnant or even dipping.
Yeah, I saw the data on the marriage rates in the stack. Something like 40 to 60% of women of childbearing age were single at any given time.
Right.
That is incredibly high.
It is. Demographers call it the European marriage pattern. It basically meant marrying late and establishing a household first, which naturally limits how many children you can have.
Makes sense.
Plus, the upper classes were actually beginning to experiment with early forms of birth control. So if you have fewer women marrying and the wealthy actively limiting family size, the math shouldn't result in a population explosion.
Unless the variable changing isn't birth, but death. So the story here isn't that people started breeding like rabbits. It's that they finally stopped dying like flies.
Precisely. The 18th century is the moment Europe finally cracked the survival equation. We aren't looking at a baby boom, we're looking at a mortality crash.
Which is arguably a much more complex thing to achieve. I mean, to stop dying requires changing the environment, the food, the economy, and the medicine all at once.
And that is exactly how we need to structure this deep dive.
Yeah.
Because to understand this for you listening, we have to look at the three interconnected revolutions that made this survival possible.
Okay, lay it out.
First, we have the biological and environmental shift, literally changing the food and the disease landscape.
Right.
Then we have the agricultural shift, the industrialization of farming, and finally the social shift. What happens when all these survivors flood into cities and completely reshape the family unit?
So our mission today is to connect the dots between the humble potato, the enclosure of village land, and a philosophical rewiring of how we treat children.
That is the roadmap. And it starts with the most basic necessity of all,
Calories.
calories.
So let's get into that first gear, the survival equation. The notes mention the Little Ice Age ending. And I think we often forget that for the 2 centuries prior, Europe was essentially in a deep freeze.
Oh, it was brutal. The Thames in London used to freeze solid enough that they would hold fairs on the ice.
Wow.
Yeah. The 16th and 17th centuries were terrible for agriculture. You had short growing seasons, frequent crop failures. But in the 18th century, the climate warmed. Nature finally stopped fighting the farmers quite so hard.
So you get a natural bump in yields just from the temperature rising. But humans didn't just sit back and enjoy the sunshine, right? They changed what they were growing.
They did.
This is where the Columbian Exchange really starts to pay dividends.
Exactly. The introduction of crops from the Americas had been happening for a while, obviously, but the 18th century is when they became the bedrock of the European diet. And the MVP here is, of course, the potato.
We really shouldn't underestimate the potato. It's not just another vegetable. In terms of caloric density per acre, it just blows wheat out of the water.
It does. It's nutrient dense, it's rich in calories, and crucially, it grows underground.
Right.
This matters because if a hailstorm or a late frost hits a wheat field, the crop is destroyed. You starve. But the potato was resilient. It provided a safety net that Europe had never really had before.
That's fascinating.
Along with maize, it helped create a roughly 50% food surplus by 1750.
And that surplus is the key. For most of history, you are one bad harvest away from starvation. But a 50% buffer means you can survive a bad year.
Yes.
But having a mountain of potatoes in France doesn't really help a starving village in Prussia unless you can actually move the food.
And that's the second part of this biological equation. The 18th century saw a massive infrastructure boom. Governments started treating roads and canals as strategic assets. They
Ah.
connected the rural hinterlands directly to the major markets.
So we move from localized subsistence, where if your specific village crop fails, you literally die, to an integrated market where food flows to where it's needed most.
Exactly. It smoothed out the spikes in mortality that were normally caused by local famines. But, food is only half the battle. You can be well-fed and still die of the plague.
Which brings us to the medical miracle of this era. The sources point out that the bubonic plague, the literal grim reaper of Europe for centuries, effectively vanished.
Yeah.
The last big outbreak was in Marseille in 1720, and then nothing.
That disappearance is still debated among historians, but it's likely a combination of better quarantine procedures, governments actually getting organized enough to shut down borders, and perhaps some biological changes in the rat populations.
Interesting.
But while the plague left kind of by accident, the fight against smallpox was very intentional.
Yes. This is one of my favorite parts of the research stack. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu.
Yes.
She wasn't a doctor. She was an aristocrat. But she essentially forced British medicine to wake up.
She is such a fascinating figure. So she was living in the Ottoman Empire, in Constantinople, where her husband was an ambassador.
Yeah.
And she noticed that the local women had this practice called engrafting.
Right.
They would take pus from a smallpox victim, someone with a mild case, and literally scratch it into the skin of a healthy person.
Which, sounds absolutely horrifying by modern standards.
Oh, it was incredibly risky.
Yeah.
You were intentionally infecting someone with a deadly disease. But the Ottomans knew that this usually resulted in a mild illness, and then you had lifelong immunity.
Wow.
Lady Montagu had her own children inoculated this way. And when she brought the idea back to England, the medical establishment was, well, skeptical, to say the least.
I can imagine a woman bringing a folk remedy from the East, telling the Royal College of Physicians how to do their job. That must have gone over incredibly well.
There was massive resistance. But she had high-level connections, including the Princess of Wales.
That helps.
It does, once it was proven to work on prisoners and orphans.
The classic guinea pigs of the era.
Sadly, yes. Once it worked on them, it started to spread among the upper classes.
It sets a massive precedent, though. It's the first time we see public health shifting from, pray and repent to let's biologically intervene.
Correct. Now, it wasn't vaccination yet. That comes a bit later with Jenner and cowpox. But inoculation dropped the death rate significantly among the elites and eventually the broader population.
So if we recap, we have better weather, supercrops, supply chains, and the beginning of disease control. That keeps people alive.
Yes.
But to feed 190 million people, you can't just rely on potatoes in the backyard garden. You need to industrialize the food supply itself.
Right.
Which leads us to the agricultural revolution.
This is the real engine of the population growth.
Yeah.
You simply cannot support that population density with medieval farming techniques. And the main bottleneck was the fallow system.
Right, the fallow system. To put this in perspective for you listening, the fallow system is basically economic insanity.
It really is.
It's like a car factory shutting down 30% of its assembly line every single year, just to let the machines rest. You're leaving a huge chunk of your land completely empty to recover nutrients.
That's a perfect analogy. The land had to rest because wheat sucks nitrogen out of the soil. If you don't let it rest, the soil dies. But in the 18th century, farmers, borrowing some techniques from the Dutch, realized they could rotate crops instead.
So they didn't have to leave it empty.
Exactly. They started planting turnips and clover.
And clover is the magic bullet here, right? Because it fixes nitrogen from the air back into the soil, so you literally never have to leave the land empty.
It recharges the soil while it grows.
Right.
And the beauty of the system is that humans don't eat clover, but livestock does.
Right.
So you plant clover, you feed more cattle and sheep, which gives you more meat, more wool, and crucially more manure.
Which is the best fertilizer. So it's a closed loop. Better soil, more animals, more fertilizer, better crops.
Exactly. It turned the farm into a machine.
Yeah.
And then you have literal machines entering the picture too, like Jethro Tull's seed drill.
Right, because before Tull, sowing seeds was basically just throwing handfuls of grain on the ground and crossing your fingers that the birds didn't eat at all.
Which is incredibly wasteful. The seed drill planted seeds at the precise depth and spacing for maximum germination. So yields just skyrocketed.
But...
And this is the dark underbelly of this whole revolution. Efficiency usually comes at a human cost.
Always.
This is where we have to talk about the enclosure acts.
Mm.
Because we often frame the agricultural revolution as this huge triumph of technology, but for the average peasant, it was a complete catastrophe.
It was a massive systemic dispossession, because to make the seed drill and crop rotation work efficiently, you need scale.
You can't do it on a tiny plot.
Right. You can't do it on the old medieval system of scattered little strips of land shared by the entire village.
Yeah.
You need big, consolidated commercial fields.
So the wealthy landowners went to Parliament and basically said, we need to fence this land off. And since Parliament was made up entirely of wealthy landowners, they passed thousands of enclosure acts. They legally privatized the common land.
This effectively destroyed the peasant way of life. If you were a small farmer, you relied on that common land to graze your one cow or gather firewood or forage.
Yeah.
When that gets fenced off, you starve.
It turned a massive class of independent subsistence farmers into landless wage laborers. They had no choice. They were pushed out.
And this is the crucial push factor for the next shift we need to talk about. These people didn't just evaporate.
Bro.
They had to go somewhere. They were essentially refugees of efficiency.
Exactly. They became the labor fuel for the Industrial Revolution. They migrated to the only place that might have worked, which was the cities.
So let's look at that urban crisis.
Mm.
We have 190 million people in Europe now, many of them landless and desperate, flooding into cities that were absolutely not designed to hold them.
Crisis is really the only word for it.
Yeah.
Urbanization in the 18th century was rapid, it was chaotic, and it was completely unregulated. London, Paris, Vienna, they just exploded in size.
And we're not talking about modern apartment buildings here. We're talking about tenements.
Jerry built death traps. Developers would cram as many rooms as possible into a tiny footprint. There was no ventilation, no sunlight, and of course, no indoor plumbing.
The sensory experience of an 18th century city must have been just overwhelming. The notes mention the great stink in later years, but it really starts here. Cesspools overflowing, waste literally in the streets.
It was a biological hazard. It's this tragic irony. Rural mortality was dropping because of better food, but urban mortality was skyrocketing because of the filth.
Wow.
Diseases like tuberculosis were rampant. Cities were actually what demographers call population sinks.
Meaning?
More people died in them than were born in them. They only grew because the migration from the countryside was so relentless.
But it wasn't just a biological shock for these people. It was a huge social shock. You take a person from a village of 200 people where everyone knows everyone,
Right.
and you drop them into a slum with 50,000 total strangers. That profoundly changes how human beings interact.
It creates anonymity. In a village, social order is maintained by shame and reputation. If you steal a chicken, everyone knows you did it.
Yeah.
But in London, nobody knows who you are. The traditional social bonds completely dissolved.
Which leads to what the upper classes called urban ills: crime, prostitution, gin alleys. And the government's response to this is fascinating, according to the sources.
Very much so.
They didn't try to fix the housing or the wages, they tried to police the behavior.
Right. They treated poverty as a crime. If you look at the Vagrancy Act of 1822 in England now, it's a bit later, but it's the direct culmination of this 18th century anxiety.
Okay.
It gave the state power to arrest people, essentially just for being poor and visible.
It really feels like the birth of the modern police state mentality. The idea that the mob is something to be managed and controlled, not a group of citizens to be helped.
It was pure social containment. The ruling class looked at these teeming, dirty cities and saw a revolutionary threat. So they responded with the workhouse and the baton, not the welfare check. You have to remember, they were terrified.
So we have the farm revolution pushing people out, the city revolution grinding them down. But there is a third revolution that happens kind of behind closed doors.
Yes.
And arguably, this one had the longest lasting impact on who we are today: the invention of childhood.
This is the most subtle but profound shift we look at today. Biologically, children have always existed, obviously, but childhood as a protected, innocent phase of life, that is a very modern invention.
Before this period, the sources literally describe children as miniature adults.
Yes. The prevailing view for centuries was that children were born with original sin and needed to be broken into obedience.
Yikes.
Exactly. As soon as they could walk, they worked. They dressed like little adults. They drank watered-down beer like little adults.
But then comes the Enlightenment, and specifically Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Rousseau drops a total bombshell on European society with his book Emile. He argues that children are actually born naturally good and innocent.
A complete 180.
Right. He says we shouldn't treat them like employees or little sinners. We should nurture their development.
It's the shift from training a beast to gardening a flower.
That's a great way to put it. And this philosophical shift collides perfectly with the demographic reality we started with.
The lower death rate.
Right. When 50% of your kids die before age 5, which was incredibly common in the 17th century, parents psychologically guarded themselves.
You had to.
You couldn't invest too much emotional energy into a child who probably wouldn't make it. It's just a defense mechanism.
But once that death rate drops, once you can be reasonably sure your kid will actually survive to adulthood, you can afford to fall in love with them.
You can invest emotionally and financially. And we actually see this in the art of the time. In the 1600s, kids in portraits are these stiff little dolls standing in the background.
Yeah, looking like tiny businessmen.
Exactly. But by the late 1700s, they are center stage. They're playing with toys, wearing comfortable clothes. They become the true focus of the family.
And the state catches on to this, too. This is when we see the beginning of mass education, isn't it?
Yes. Leaders like Napoleon or the administrators in the Austrian Empire, they realized that the nation isn't just territory, it's people.
Right.
If you want a strong nation, you need healthy, educated, loyal citizens.
So education moves from being a church thing or a family thing to a state thing.
Because the state realizes that children are a resource. It sounds a bit cold, but that's the logic. To build a modern army and a modern economy, you need to shape the child. Rousseau provided the philosophy, but the state provided the schools.
So let's try to synthesize all of this for the listener. We started with a simple statistic, massive population growth. But to explain it, we had to tear apart the entire fabric of 18th century life.
It's a total domino effect. Better climate and potatoes lower the death rate.
Right.
Lower death rates and better farming create a surplus population. That surplus gets pushed off the land by the enclosure acts and floods into the cities.
Which become chaotic crucibles.
Exactly. And that chaos forces the government to invent modern policing and public health. And amidst all that, the family turns inward and invents the modern idea of childhood.
It really is the big bang of the modern world. I mean, the world of surplus, of urban living, of state education, of police. It all starts right here because Europe stopped dying.
It does. And if we look at the legacy of that, the sources point to a really provocative question for us today.
Oh, what's that?
Well, the institutions we rely on right now, public health, urban planning, the school system, the police, they were all designed in the 18th and early 19th centuries as a panic response to this sudden explosion of people.
Right.
They were essentially triage measures to handle the crowd.
Oh, that is a heavy thought. We are trying to run a 21st century society on software that was written to manage an 18th century crisis?
Exactly. It makes you wonder, are we still just managing the mob like they did with the Vagrancy Act? Or have we actually evolved past the panic of the 1700s?
Man, that is something for you to chew on the next time you're stuck in city traffic or reading about school reform. We are still living in the house the 18th century built. We're just renting the rooms.
We certainly are.
Well, that is all we have time for on this deep dive. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next century.